Hello, I'm Bill O'Donnell, and welcome to another program on spirituality. We're just beginning part two with our interview with Father John Deere here today, and welcome back, Father John.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Um, in the first one, we talked about a lot of John's early life, but we're really here to promote his newest book, The Gospel of Peace. Can you see that okay, cameraman? Okay. It's a terrific book. It just came out this year. I mean, it's been out less than a month, and it's really a great book. So you want to tell them about it?
Sure. So always interested in Jesus, of course, but kind of a fanatic of Jesus, but also interested in peace. And Gandhi always used this clumsy word, nonviolence. So did Richard McSorley and Daniel Berrigan and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day. And over the decades, I've been this is really about my 40th book, because I've been constantly writing about peace and nonviolence, first of all for myself to understand it and teach myself the scriptures and all. But slowly, I was thinking beforehand, what happened to me was I got involved with Mother Teresa, and I used to call her and get her to speak on the telephone to a governor the night before an execution. And the governor would cancel the execution because she would talk to him. And then I would call her back and get her to make a statement to the press. She agreed to all of this, and we became friendly. And I said to her the very first time in 1990, I did this, "So what did you say to the governor?" And she said to me on the phone in Calcutta, "I told him to do what Jesus would do." I said, "Did you tell him not to kill the guy in death row?" "No, John, I told him to do what Jesus would do." And I was kind of upset with her. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
She because that was cut to a much deeper level. And she looked kind of silly publicly doing that, but she was very intentional about it. And here I am in and out of jail with the Berrigans, and people saying, "Why are you doing this?" I started to do that. Well, I'm just doing what Jesus would do, which is do everything they can to stop war and nuclear weapons and poverty and racism and killing. So over the decades, I started digging deeper into talking about and studying Jesus. So I discovered that Gandhi said Jesus was the greatest person of nonviolence in the history of the world. And then poor Gandhi went on and said, and the only people who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians.
That's right.
And, in very provocative language. Martin Luther King later is only using the language of nonviolence, morning, noon, and night. I've really studied Gandhi and Dr. King. I claim to have read everything they've written and said. I'm a little over the top. So eventually I started writing books about Jesus and nonviolence and the scriptures and nonviolence. And then the pandemic hit. And, I was locked up where I was living. And I always felt called by God to do this and was trying to get away from it, to write a commentary on the Gospels from a Gandhian, Kingian perspective of nonviolence. I was taught this in theology. They have this big word called hermeneutic. I'm trying to impress you, Bill. It's
I'm
not
very
working. You're impressed?
Oh, sure.
So
I can't spell it, but I know what it means.
So this is a commentary on the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as if Gandhi and Martin Luther King are reading each sentence, showing how Jesus is more nonviolent in every which way than Gandhi and Dr. King. My friend, the publisher of Orbis, wouldn't let me do John because he says,
No time.
"I'm not publishing a 1,000-page book by you. I wanted a 4-box set."
Yeah.
Why not? Anyway, so it's my life's work, Bill. And I've spent 5 years full-time on this. After all I've been through and all I was taught by my teachers, Richard McSorley and Daniel Berrigan, and Mother Teresa and Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, I've literally been schooled since that day in Galilee that we talked about in the last program on the Sermon on the Mount. And it was funny, just to connect what we're sharing here with the last program. I really was a dopey 21-year-old kid and entered the Jesuits fresh from that experience. And I didn't know how do you live the Sermon on the Mount? And no one was around to teach me. So I thought, well, I'll just ask the greatest people on the planet. And that meant Daniel Berrigan, Philip Berrigan, Richard McSorley. And then I heard Coretta Scott King was going to be in D.C. I went and spent an evening with her, talking with her. I was 22. And I said, hey, Mrs. King, I'm going to get arrested at the Pentagon tomorrow. You want to come and get arrested with me? The poor woman, who later became my friend.
Yeah.
She just saw that I was on fire and encouraged me, as did Mother Teresa and Archbishop Tutu, because I don't know that I had met a young American Catholic seminarian, certainly Coretta never. And they said, go for it. And they stayed with me as long as they were alive. So I started writing this, and so I'm now on a 5-month speaking tour around the country to talk about this book. It's never been done before. In fact, nobody writes commentaries anymore. After Vatican II, there were a number of them. And you know, it's 500 pages. This is the short version. And, but I go through the 3 synoptic gospels, starting with Matthew, which begins with the Sermon on the Mount. So shall I say a word about that?
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, but it all goes back to my history that we talked about in the last program, the Beatitudes and the 6 antitheses. You've heard it said, thou shalt not kill, Jesus says. I say, don't even get angry. Instead, go and be reconciled with every human being. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, in the Greek it says, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. That's the commandment of nonviolence. And Gandhi read that every morning and every evening for the last 45 years of his life. Think about it, and he's not even Christian. And I know this because I'm such a Gandhi fanatic. I went to India for a month with Arun Gandhi, his grandson, who was raised by Gandhi 25 years ago or something. And we went to all the places where Gandhi lived, where he was assassinated. We went to his prison. We went to his ashram. Arun showed me where they prayed, where he heard Gandhi read that verse. And and I've studied this because I published an anthology, what I thought were the Gandhi's greatest teachings. It's called Mohandas Gandhi Essential Writings. I later did Daniel Berrigan Essential Writings. And, you know, there Gandhi is grappling with, how do we offer no violent resistance to one who does evil? Someone's going to do violence to you. We are forbid to respond with violence. That's the commandment. And Jesus never does. Jesus is the epitome, the embodiment of active, creative, loving nonviolence unto death. Even Gandhi says Jesus goes even deeper on the cross. That's why later King says not only is nonviolence a spiritual path, a way of life, the only tactic and strategy in the face of tyranny and oppression, it's a political methodology to transform the world. But King said Gandhi was the greatest theologian. That's deep teaching, that a Hindu understood Jesus better than any other person who ever lived. And I decided as a kid to take Martin and Coretta very seriously. And I became friends with a lot of Dr. King's friends. And Jim Lawson, who's still alive at 95, called me after this came out, and he said, Martin and I didn't know you could do this. He was involved in the civil rights movement. He's my friend. He actually later, in the late 90s, hired me to be the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which taught Jim and Martin nonviolence in the 50s through Bayard Rustin and my friend Glenn Smiley, who I got to know. Well, anyway, that's not even the climax. Then it leads up to, you have heard it said, love your countrymen and hate your enemies, but I say to you, love your enemies. So I go through great detail about the Sermon on the Mount, leading up to that commandment, love your enemies, which no one had ever said before in history. And as Richard McSorley and Daniel Berrigan told me and taught me, we've done everything we can to wish he never said it and come up with a just war theory. Like there's sometimes you just got to kill somebody or bomb somebody, which is not what it says in the text. It's unconditional love. It's the most political sentence in the entire Bible and the heart of all the 4 Gospels. But what's so amazing, Bill, It's just so touching. If you're interested in spirituality, the way I put it is, there, in the most political sentence in the entire Bible, Jesus gives the greatest description of the nature of the mystery of God. Why should we love our enemies? Because didn't we agree in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, you are the sons and daughters of the God of peace? Because then you're really sons and daughters of the God who lets the sun rise on the good and the bad, and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Such beautiful nature images to describe God as a God of universal nonviolent love. And I think we have spent 2,000 years doing everything we can to teach a false spirituality of violence and war. Blessed are the war makers. God blesses the troops, our country, or any country. The message of the anti-gospel, the anti-Sermon on the Mount of our country today, or any country, is love your countrymen and kill your enemies. No. We practice the universal love of Jesus and God. We practice the universal peace and nonviolence of God. And because we are sons and daughters of a God of universal love and peace. And it's really important teaching. It means that we're from now on not only learning from Gandhi and Dr. King, if you will, the politics and methodology of nonviolence, to stand up to get the British to leave India nonviolently, to bring down segregation nonviolently, and now nonviolence is being used by movements around the world to protect Mother Earth and end racism and poverty. But also, for the first time in the last 50, 75 years, in ways that Gandhi and Dr. King could never have dreamed of, we are beginning a new theology and spirituality of nonviolence that says God is a God of peace and nonviolence. Isn't that great? And it's really going to change the church, because we're going back to the original church. To be a Christian today is to be a person who lives out the Sermon on the Mount and follows the nonviolence of Jesus, which means the church is the community of followers of the nonviolent Jesus, the community of the Sermon on the Mount, the community that practices universal love and total nonviolence. Therefore, we can't be Christians or Catholic and support war, join any military, have any guns, support violence or racism or corporate greed or the destruction of earth in any forms. Because our guy was a person of total nonviolence. So what I do in the book, The Gospel of Peace, I go through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I go through literally every sentence. And this is how he taught it in Matthew. This is how he lived it. And then it all leads up to Luke, where in chapter 10, he forms a movement. I always joke, Bill, that Jesus thinks he's Gandhi or Dr. King.
Yeah. It's a screwy joke. I love it.
Yeah, I'm going to get in a lot more trouble for saying that. But you
Yeah.
see what I'm trying to get at. No one talks about this. It's there in the scriptures, but I wonder how, we're reading everything and doing everything but the Sermon on the Mount. And when you go into the fine print, which I really invite everybody to do, if you want to learn the spirituality of love and peace, just read the Gospels first and foremost, every day for the rest of your life. And I also say don't read St. Paul and don't read a lot of other stuff. Really learn the Gospels.
First.
Yeah. It'll take you about 30 years. And you see in Luke 10, he sends the 72 out in pairs as lambs into the midst of wolves. Talk about a description of nonviolence. Like we all have to become Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Martin King. Total nonviolence into the culture of war. Why? To heal everybody who's victims of violence. To expel all ways we're possessed by violence in the culture. And to proclaim the coming of the kingdom of God, which Gandhi said. I found a sentence, an obscure writing of Gandhi, where Gandhi's writing to a friend and says, the kingdom of God is nonviolence. I called Jim Lawson about 15 years ago when I found that, Dr. King's friend. I said, you won't believe what I found from Gandhi. He never heard that either. And he went, wow. And we've lost so much ground since Gandhi, if you will, that Gandhi had reached that point to understand Jesus. The kingdom of God is no more war, No more nuclear weapons, no more racism or sexism. We're all equal. It's a new realm of universal love, universal compassion, universal peace, total nonviolence. And Jesus says it's here and now if we want to enter into it. But you just can't have anything to do with violence and war ever again. But this is good news. And what's so amazing in Luke 10, which to me is kind of the climax of the Synoptic Gospels, is that the disciples go out and do it, and they come back rejoicing because everybody was changing. No one is talking like this. I think we all have to carry on that grassroots mission of Jesus. They come back rejoicing, and Jesus says in the Greek, don't rejoice because you're got power over the culture of war and the craziness of America and everybody's going crazy. Rejoice because your names are written in heaven. And so they rejoice because their names are written in heaven. Then it says the only time in the four Gospels Jesus rejoiced and he's happy. And I always joke, even if you don't know why to get involved in peace and justice, nonviolence, do it just to make the poor guy happy.
Well, my favorite line is, all this I tell you why, so my joy may be yours and your joy may be complete by loving as I have loved you.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's not in the Synoptics. See, that's so interesting, isn't it? I kind of gone through every single sentence of the Gospels.
Yeah.
And Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same story. And it's clear, all the scholars agree, we know they were written just before or just after the year 70. And if people don't know this, they need to know. What happened in the year 70? Well, there were dozens of rebel groups going around trying to get the Roman Empire out of ancient Palestine. Just like you could call it Hamas or the FMLN or the Shining Path of Peru, the Viet Cong. It's violent rebellion. And Jesus comes along in the middle of all of this insanity and the Roman occupation and says, friends, we're going to be people of total nonviolence, but it's revolutionary, active nonviolence. So Mark is written in the year 68, before the destruction. And Jesus is kind of a nonviolent revolutionary, but it's from a God of nonviolence. And really, it's a call in Mark of radical discipleship as nonviolent resistance to empire and obedience to the God of peace. And it ends with just before, look, if you don't follow me, all of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. You're all going to be destroying one another, which is what happened. Matthew and Luke are clearly written 2 to 5 to 10 years after that. And so it's kind of, if you don't follow me and fulfill the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, you're all going to be destroyed. John is written 50 years later by a completely different community. I call it like the Pax Christi Catholic worker version. It's not the Petrine community.
That's right.
And we also, the empire, the movement has become this illegal movement called the Way. Christianity was an illegal religion for the first 3 centuries because you were saying our guy's God, not your guy. And we can't kill, so we're not joining your army. And the minute you were baptized, like within a couple hours, you were beheaded.
Yeah.
That was the way it went. So John, some scholars think, was written as late as 120. We know in the, I hope you don't mind me saying all this.
No, I love it. Our first, both my first name is John, as yours is too. That's why we're ending with John. Go ahead.
They wouldn't let me add John in there.
We're putting it out in the visual form.
So, but what's so amazing is John rewrites the whole story. So if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a story where Jesus is leading a Gandhian, Kingian campaign, marching to Jerusalem. He does civil disobedience in the temple. Well, you do that, you're going to be arrested and tortured and killed. And they all run away from him, and Jesus' last words are to the community, put down the sword. And they finally get who he is, and he's killed, and Gandhi says Jesus goes deep into nonviolence, and he rises from the dead. He's still nonviolent and says, now you go and carry on my campaign. John begins 50 years after that, with the civil disobedience in the temple. Nobody talks about that. We have the wedding at Cana, and then the next thing you know, Jesus is turning over tables. I wrote a book about this because I couldn't figure it out. So that's why my friend wouldn't let me. It's called Lazarus Come Forth. So John's gospel rewrites the story, and it leads up to John 11, the raising of Lazarus. But what people don't know is in John 9, the blind man, it says in the Greek, the beginning of chapter 9 in John, like, why would you go past Matthew, Mark, and Luke? There's a point.
Yeah.
Jesus walked by and saw what most Americans would read, a man born blind from birth. In the Greek it says, humanity born blind from birth. So when he heals the blind man, he's healing human race. So then it says his best friend is now dying and dead, and he doesn't go to raise him. Why? I hope maybe now you'll believe. Lazarus is the human race, humanity, stuck in the culture of death. Death. Jesus is the God of life, like the boy on Tiananmen Square walking to the tomb. And there's the 3 new commandments. Take away the stone. And the women, Martha and Mary, try to stop Jesus. Don't raise him. Think of the stench.
Right.
They resist resurrection.
Yeah.
We don't want nonviolence, hope, universal love, life. Jesus disregards them. They take away the stone. Lazarus, come forth. Humanity, come out of the culture of death. You're no longer slaves to death and war. And the 3rd commandment, unbind humanity and let him go free. And then they have that long discourse where it says, if you go deep into agape love, then my joy will be in you and your joy will be complete. There are glimpses of that in the synoptics. But it really is spectacular writing. The writing of the Gospels, to me, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are really communities named after them, communities of women and men, are the greatest writings in human history. And there's no ego in them, you know? Right. And there are other Gospels, but I like the decision of the early church not to put, say, the Gospel of Thomas into the canon. Why? Because they don't have the cross. These Gospels are all about the way of nonviolence, as Gandhi and Dr. King taught. And what I hope is that people will get this, read it, talk about it in their parishes, and let's reclaim the whole church in the United States and the world back to the nonviolence of Jesus and make the poor guy happy and do what we can to end war and poverty and nuclear weapons. Can I say that? Is that all right?
I think you did.
Okay.
But as we've come down near the end of this second segment, there are those of us who need to ask the question, even though we believe in what you're saying and what Jesus taught, what do we say to the Secretary of Defense? What role should he have to change in his mind when he has the responsibility of protecting the government or protecting the humanity, or police officers who get wrapped up in their work of defending people from harm? And you and I were both raised at a time when my father went to World War II, his father was involved in World War I, and that sort of thing. And so we're still trying to come out of that dilemma, So have compassion for yourself first in whatever dilemma you're faced with, but what advice can we have for those who want to take the bull and run with it, run with the ball?
I go back to what we talked about in the first program. We're all going to die. We're all going to meet God, and she's going to be, I love you so much. And did you follow Jesus? And I gave you great people like Gandhi and Dr. King and Dorothy Day. And we're going to go, no, because we thought that doesn't work. We have to have war. And I'm saying war doesn't work. Violence doesn't work. Let's just grow up and do what Jesus wanted, and really seek the God of peace, and practice the steadfast nonviolence of him, and let the chips fall where they may, including the social, economic, political, racial, environmental implications of all of this. So I have you grew up with Richard McSorley and Daniel Berrigan and Mother Teresa and all these great saints that I've known. From day one, I have been talking the way I'm talking with you now for 45 years, saying, folks, that doesn't work. Quit the military. Get rid of your guns. Let's dismantle nuclear weapons. I've told thousands of people that one-on-one. Many have. I've talked many people out of the military, and some from quitting their jobs at Los Alamos. But since you asked about the Secretary of the Defense, I was living in El Salvador, as you know, and almost killed many times by the death squads. interrogated and so forth. It was quite exciting. But, you know, I'm with the Jesuits, and you really get over death. By the way, didn't we agree in the resurrection? You know, like our survival is already guaranteed.
Yeah.
Death doesn't get the last word. So if you're practicing nonviolence, there's nothing to be afraid of. Oh, right. Well, then I'm fine. I come home to tell my father. He picked me up at the airport from El Salvador. And he's going, no, this isn't working for me. And he goes, well, I never told you this, but my best friend is the Secretary of the Army. I'm going, great. I've arranged for you to see him tomorrow. He can't wait to meet you. I went into the Pentagon, where I'd been arrested many times, into the height of the whole thing, to Reagan's Secretary of the Army. And I had an hour with him like this. After having been with people being killed, I'd seen the bombs. And I pleaded with them. Quit your job. End the war on Nicaragua today. End the funding of the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala today. I gave him some books on nonviolence. And he let me talk for 45 minutes, and then he laughed at me and said, you are pretty darn impressive. I have to say, would you be interested in working for me here at the Pentagon? And I gave him a cross. I gave him some things I brought from Nicaragua. But since then, Bill, I've become friends with President Clinton, President Carter, a lot of senators and Congress people, people in the military. That's not been my focus, though. And to all kinds of people. My message is still the message, what I was raised with, and the message of the gospel is, it's not that we don't defend ourselves. We don't get to defend ourselves violently. We get to defend ourselves non-violently through the methodology of love and peace and truth. Whether in one-on-one, we practice the nonviolence of Jesus to disarm our opponent and let the Spirit of God work through us so someone who's insane with violence disarms. Or Gandhi says we apply it to the world. I've seen it work throughout my whole life, and I'm going to keep on teaching it.
We'll keep it on. We've run out of time, but it's been just a great time to be with you and have a chance to share it with. I hope that some of the things that Father John has said to you will be of value to you in your life. I agree with him. I say, read those Gospels, read them for yourself. I try to read them every year, at least the New Testament, and it's been a blessing. And every time you do read it, it goes deeper, and go behind the words. Read through it, like he gave an example of what the word actually meant in Greek or something. So don't give up for wherever you are. So on behalf of everybody here, Father John, thank you so much. Thank you for everybody here, our director, George, our camera people, Bill and Alan, and our production assistants, Jeff and Casey. Thanks very much. Thank you for viewing. Watch us next week for another program on spirituality.